Just in terms of, it was interesting when Senator Black talked about people who go into recovery and come out, and a third of people end up relapsing. There is very little research done on the reasons why they relapse, and they are very broad and they vary. For instance, people can relapse if they're coming out of a rehabilitation centre, a residential centre. One of the major obstacles facing them is housing. In many cases, they have no option but to go back into homeless shelters where drug use is prevalent, and that contributes to them relapsing. There are many other issues, but I would agree there's very little research. But the area I wanted to touch on is drug addiction within the prisons. 85% of women who are in the prison population have an addiction, and 70% of men have an addiction. Now, the first question I would ask is, why is that? Now, I believe it's because we have a system where addicts are criminalised, and the vast majority of drug convictions within this state, I think the figure is 86%, but I stand to be corrected. I know it's in excess of 80% of all drug convictions are convictions for being caught with drugs for personal use. So if we were to address that, what impact would it have on penal reform and sentencing? And the second follow-up question to that is, when you get a drug conviction, it's a conviction for life. So even if somebody goes into rehab, comes out clean, never reoffends again, they have a drug conviction hanging over them for the rest of their life, which can have, you know, very severe consequences for that individual for the rest of their life. And the question is, what role do spent convictions have, particularly for those individuals who have addictions? I know the government, this government and the previous government, has talked a lot about spent convictions, but we've seen very little action in relation to it. And when we're talking about penal reform and sentencing, I believe that spent convictions has a huge role to play. Obviously, the goal should be to try and avoid a prison sentence, but if somebody is convicted and they have that conviction, I don't believe personally that that conviction should stay with them for life. You know, you get a conviction, you do your time, you do your punishment. Part of that is being rehabilitated back into the community. I think it's counterproductive to try and rehabilitate somebody back into society to stop them from reoffending, but on the other hand tell them that they have to carry a conviction for the rest of their days, I think is just wrong. And I just wondered what's your own opinion on it.
Thank you, Deputy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deputy O'Brien. I suppose at root we don't believe that addicts should be, or people with substance abuse, substance misuse issues should be criminalised in order to access treatment. I mean, that's a fundamental issue here. And the same applies to women in particular. There's a cohort of women for whom prison is a place of respite. There is no more damning indictment on society when anybody thinks that prison is the safest place that they can be. So there's a huge issue that's beyond prison, which is about provision of safe, supported housing in the community, and which needs to be addressed. The same applies to children. There's documented overuse of remand for children in order to access mental health assessment up in Oberstown, which is another issue. About 50% of children are on remand at any one time, and this compares with 15% of the adult population. So, put simply, nobody should be criminalised in order to access treatments and services that they need in the community, and that's a full stop. You asked about the decriminalisation of drugs for personal use. We don't believe that it would necessarily have a huge impact on the prison population. We know that citywide and other better informed groups than ourselves in terms of understanding the paths of desistance and towards recovery of addictions have proposed that, and so we stand by their proposal. We believe that, so if somebody has addiction issues, I don't think personal use is going to be the problem. It's going to be all the other crime that comes with an addiction, so shoplifting or burglary and other crimes. And to that end, couldn't agree with you more about spent convictions legislation and the need to acknowledge and respond to people who have demonstrated that they have moved away from their offending behaviour. We ask people to stop offending, and when they stop offending, we need to acknowledge that and reduce any barriers they might continue to receive through having a criminal record, such as access to jobs, to training, to education, to travel, to even getting home insurance or car insurance. The Irish Penal Reform Trust has campaigned on this issue since at least 2008. It's a huge issue. Finally, in April 2016, the Criminal Justice Spent Convictions and Certain Disclosures Act was introduced in January, signed into law in February, and commenced in April. We find it extremely disappointingly limited. We acknowledge that it will be of benefit to many people, but it's extremely limited in terms of its application, and we believe it fails in terms of supporting rehabilitation of people with more serious offending. So as it stands, as you've indicated, if somebody has two separate convictions, aside from minor motoring offences and public order offences, there's no limit to the number of those that can become spent, but only one other conviction can become spent. And if you have two or more, neither of them can become spent. It's a huge issue. So if you have, and it just doesn't pay any attention to the circumstances that contributed to a person's offending behaviour at the time, which could have been youth, it could be addictions, it could be poverty, it could be any range, but it kind of presumes that one contact with the criminal justice system is enough for people to escape all those disadvantaged and marginalised circumstances, which we know is not the case. And we also know that people grow up and move away from crime and move on, and we hear from people so often who are now in their late 20s, they've got married, they've kids, they want to move to Australia, they've moved away from impulsive, low self-regulated, immature behaviour when they're 18, 19, 20, and those convictions pursue them 20, 30, 40 years after the fact. So if you have two separate convictions for shoplifting, for example, from 20 years ago, they are still on your record indefinitely. So we would strongly welcome a review and more attention being paid to this issue. There were proposals reported in the papers last week of an extension of, so we've generous provision for offences committed by people when they're aged 18 or younger, and there's a proposal that those provisions could be extended up to age 24 as a minimum, and we would strongly welcome that as a first point. But the overall point is, are we giving people second chances? Are we acknowledging that they've moved away from their offending behaviour? No one is suggesting that convictions are removed from your criminal record overnight. You demonstrate that you've moved on, and then society needs to acknowledge people's efforts. So we welcome that.